If you own property in Western North Carolina, especially in areas affected by Tropical Storm Helene, there's been major news in the past few weeks about FEMA buyout programs, reconstruction timelines, and what all of this means for real estate values across the region. I'm O'Neill Scott with your Asheville Connection. And in this video, I'm walking you through what's happening with FEMA property buyouts, who qualifies, and how the process works. What's happening with reconstruction in heavily affected areas like Swannanoa, and what this means for property values and the broader Western North Carolina real estate market. This is important information if you own property in Western North Carolina, especially if you're in a flood zone or your property was damaged by Helene. Let's start with the FEMA buyout program and what just got approved. In mid-January 2026, the Department of Homeland Security announced that FEMA approved a $23 million in hazard mitigation grant program funding for property acquisitions in Western North Carolina. This includes $14.2 million for properties in Buncombe County and $9.2 million for Henderson County. Here's how the buyout program works. FEMA provides funding to state and local governments to purchase properties that have been repeatedly flooded or are in high-risk flood zones. The goal is to remove homes and structures from flood-prone areas permanently. Once a property is purchased through this program, the structure is demolished and the land is deed restricted to prevent future development. The land typically becomes greenway, parkland, or conservation area. For homeowners, this program offers a way out if your property has been damaged by flooding, if you're in a high-risk flood zone, or if you don't want to deal with the uncertainty and cost of rebuilding only to potentially face another flood event in the future. Now, here's what's important. Buncombe and Henderson counties submitted applications for nearly 300 properties. The recent FEMA approval covers a portion of those, likely several dozen properties in the first batch. Not all 300 applications were approved in this round. If your property was included in the county's application and FEMA approved it, the county will contact you to begin the pre-offer process. This involves a property survey and appraisal. The county then makes an offer to purchase your property. If you accept, the demolition and land transfer process moves forward. So, who qualifies for a FEMA buyout? And how do you apply if you haven't already? Properties that typically qualify are those that experienced substantial damage from Helene. That would be 50% or more of the property's value. Are in FEMA designated special flood hazard areas, the 100-year floodplains, have a history of repetitive flooding, are in areas where local governments have prioritized buyouts as part of hazard mitigation planning. If your property was damaged by Helene and you're interested in a buyout, here's what you need to do. First, check if your local government, whether that's Buncombe County, Henderson County, or your municipality, has an active buyout application process. Some counties are still accepting applications for future FEMA funding rounds. Second, document everything. You'll need proof of damage, insurance claims, repair estimates, and property value documentation. FEMA and local government use this information to determine eligibility and calculate the offer price. Third, understand the timeline. Even if you're approved, the buyout process takes months. There's a property survey, appraisal, even offer negotiation, acceptance, demolition contracting, and final land transfer. The entire process can take 6 to 18 months from approval to closing. Fourth, be aware that the buyout offers are typically based on pre-disaster fair market value, not replacement cost. This is an important distinction. If your home was worth $300,000 before Helene and now is severely damaged, the buyout offer will be based on that $300,000 pre-storm value, not what it would cost to rebuild. For some homeowners, especially those who are older, don't want to rebuild or can't afford flood insurance going forward, a buyout is a relief. For others who want to stay in their community, it's not the right option. Now let's talk about reconstruction and what's happening in the most heavily affected areas. In Swannanoa, parts of the Swannanoa Valley areas along the French Broad River, certain sections of Leicester and Marshall, reconstruction is underway, but it's a multi-year process. Some homeowners have already rebuilt or are in active construction. Others are still navigating insurance claims, permits, and financing. And some have decided not to rebuild, either because of buyout programs, financial constraints, or the decision to relocate. Buncombe County has created expedited permitting processes for Helene-related reconstruction. The goal is to reduce red tape and help homeowners get back into their homes faster. However, there are also new floodplain regulations and building requirements that apply to reconstruction in certain areas. If you're rebuilding in a special flood hazard area, your home may need to be elevated, flood-proofed, or meet other standards that weren't required before Helene. This adds cost and complexity. For neighborhoods like Swannanoa, where a significant number of homes were damaged, the recovery timeline is uneven. Some blocks look almost back to normal. Other blocks still have empty lots, damaged structures, or homes in various stages of reconstruction. This creates an uncertain environment for property values, which I'll address in a moment. So what does all this mean for property values in affected areas? Let's separate this into three categories: heavily damaged areas, moderately affected areas, and areas that were largely unaffected. In heavily damaged areas like parts of Swannanoa, River Knolls, and low-lying sections along the French Broad and Swannanoa rivers, property values are depressed in the short term. Homes that would have sold for $350,000 before Helene are now selling for $250,000 to $300,000 if they're damaged and being sold as is. However, rebuilt homes or homes that were elevated and are now compliant with new floodplain standards are holding value reasonably well. Buyers who are willing to take on flood zone properties are looking for homes that have already been brought up to current standards. In moderately affected areas, neighborhoods that experience some flooding, but where most homes are intact or have been repaired, values are holding relatively steady. There's a bit of buyer hesitation due to flood zone concerns, but well-maintained homes are still selling close to pre-Helene prices. In areas that were largely unaffected, most of North Asheville, South Asheville, parts of West Asheville, and communities like Weaverville, Arden, and Black Mountain, property values have been largely unaffected and continued modest appreciation. Buyers who are risk averse may actually be seeking out these areas specifically because they're outside of flood zones. For investors, there are opportunities. Some property owners in flood-prone areas are selling at discount because they don't want to rebuild or deal with flood insurance. Investors who understand flood mitigation, elevation requirements, and rental demand in those areas are acquiring properties. For homeowners in affected areas who are considering selling, the decision often comes down to, do you want to rebuild and stay, or do you want to sell and move to a lower risk area? There's no universal right answer. It depends on your financial situation, emotional attachment to the area, and risk tolerance. Looking ahead, here's what I'm tracking closely that affects Western North Carolina property owners. First, future FEMA funding rounds. If you applied for a buyout and weren't included in this first 23 million batch, there may be additional funding in the coming months. I'll report on new approvals as they're announced. Second, flood insurance rate changes. FEMA is in the process of updating flood maps and risk ratings across the region. This will affect flood insurance premiums for properties in and near flood zones. If you own property in these areas, your insurance costs could go up significantly. Third, development restrictions and zoning changes. Some local governments are considering new restrictions on building in floodplains or requiring higher elevation standards. If you own vacant land in a flood zone, these changes could affect your ability to develop that land. Fourth, reconstruction completion rates. As more homes are rebuilt in Swannanoa and other affected areas, we'll get a clearer picture of how the neighborhood character and property values stabilize. I'll be tracking sales data in these areas over the next 12 months. And finally, rental market dynamics. Some homeowners who can't afford to rebuild are converting to long-term rentals or selling to investors who will. This changes the composition of certain neighborhoods and affects both rental rates and property values. Stepping back, what does Helene's long-term impact mean for the broader Western North Carolina real estate market? First, there's increased awareness of flood risk. Buyers are asking more questions about flood zones, flood history, and elevation. Properties outside of flood zones are getting a premium in buyer preference. Second, there's a supply shift. Some homeowners in flood-prone areas are selling and moving to higher ground. This creates inventory in certain neighborhoods while increasing demand in others. Third, there's an infrastructure focus. Local governments are investing in stormwater management, flood mitigation, and greenway expansion along rivers. These long-term investments will reduce future flood risk and potentially stabilize property values in affected areas. Fourth, the overall Western North Carolina market remains strong outside of the heavily damaged areas. Asheville, Hendersonville, Weaverville, Black Mountain, and other communities continue to see steady demand from buyers who are focused on areas with lower flood risk. Helene was a significant event. and its effects will be felt for years. The Western North Carolina real estate market is adapting, rebuilding, and moving forward. If you own property in Western North Carolina and you're navigating decisions relating to Helene recovery, whether that's applying for a buyout, rebuilding, selling, or buying in a different area, there is help. Subscribe to this channel for ongoing updates on FEMA programs, reconstruction timelines, and Western North Carolina real estate market trends. Drop a comment below. How has Helene affected your property or your neighborhood? I'd like to hear your story. I'm O'Neill Scott with your Asheville Connection. I'll see you next Wednesday.